Before we start, I want to say that only 1% of you are subscribed. Please subscribe because when we reach 1,000 subscribers, I will post a special video for you. The afternoon bustle of the Earth's central spaceport was a cacophony of languages and the hum of machinery. Dan leaned against a railing, scanning the crowd. His job as a cultural liaison often placed him in the midst of arrivals, but today's assignment was unusual. He was to meet an alien maid, a concept both foreign and intriguing. As the crowd parted, Dan spotted her. Silera stood out with her luminescent skin and flowing garments that seemed to ripple with every movement, reminiscent of underwater flora. She looked around with a blend of awe and confusion, her eyes wide, taking in the sights and sounds of the human hub. "Silera?" Dan stepped forward, extending his hand in greeting. "Yes, I am Silera," she responded, her voice a melodious tone that reminded Dan of wind chimes. Tentatively, she reached out, her hand cool and slightly damp to the touch. "I'm Dan. I'll be helping you acclimate to Earth. I hope the journey was comfortable." "It was enlightening," Silera replied, looking around. "Everything is so solid, so dry." Dan chuckled. "Yes, it's quite different from your world, I'd imagine. Let's get your belongings and head to your new home. There's a lot to learn about each other." As they walked toward the baggage claim, Dan noticed Silera's fascination with everything, from the robotic carts whizzing by to the digital billboards. He pointed things out, explaining their function and purpose. "Why are there so many colors in that board?" Silera asked, pointing at a billboard flashing neon advertisements. "Those are ads, trying to catch as much attention as possible." "It's marketing," Dan explained. "Marketing?" She mulled over the new word, trying to fit the concept into her understanding. "Yeah, it's how businesses tell people what they have to offer. Think of it as signaling," Dan said, searching for a word she might understand. "Like the deep-sea fish that lure prey?" Silera asked, her eyes lighting up with comprehension. "Exactly like that, though usually less predatory," Dan grinned. They collected her small, waterproof bag, modest and practical. "Now, let's get you settled in. I prepared a place that should feel a bit more like home," Dan mentioned as they headed to his car. During the drive, Dan and Silera talked more about Earth and her planet, Aquise. She described her underwater city with enthusiasm, her words painting a vivid picture of bioluminescent lights and floating architecture. "And humans? Your cities are always on land?" Silera queried, her curiosity unending. "Mostly, yes. Though we do have some structures on water and even under it, but nothing as sophisticated as your world," Dan admitted. "Fascinating," Silera murmured, looking out the window at the passing cityscape. Once at his apartment, Dan showed her to her room where a humidifier was already running, casting a fine mist into the air. "This is your room. I hope the humidity helps." "It's the best I could do on short notice," Dan said apologetically. Silera's fingers trailed through the mist, a smile breaking on her face. "It's wonderful, Dan. Thank you for this kindness." "Of course. Well, I'll leave you to settle in. We can start exploring the neighborhood whenever you're ready. There's a lot of Earth to see, and I'm here to help you navigate it." As Dan left the room, Silera looked around her new space, her thoughts a mix of excitement and nervous anticipation. Outside her window, the sprawling city was a stark contrast to the serene depths of her home. Yet, there was something about it, and about her human liaison, that felt reassuringly familiar. Dan, with his easy smile and eager explanations, seemed like a good guide into the strange, dry world. And Silera was ready to dive into the unknown. Dan's apartment was sleek and modern, a stark contrast to the more fluid and organic architecture of Silera's underwater home. As they entered the living area, Dan noticed Silera pausing at the threshold, taking in the angular furniture and the large windows that let in the afternoon sun. "I read about your planet's preference for curves and natural forms," Dan began, attempting to bridge their worlds with conversation. "I imagine this must feel a bit rigid?" Silera nodded, her eyes roaming. "Yes, it is very different. On Aquais, our homes flow with the currents. Here, everything is still. It is interesting, Dan smiled, leading her towards the kitchen. Let's start with something familiar, shall we? How about you help me prepare dinner? We can make something from your world tonight. That would be delightful, Celera agreed, a spark of excitement in her voice. As Dan pulled out various ingredients from the fridge, he watched Celera closely. She moved gracefully, her hands expertly selecting spices and vegetables from the array he had bought earlier. Tell me about these dishes we're making, Dan asked as he handed her a knife and a cutting board. We will make the Lassian stew. It is a comforting dish, warm and filling, Celera explained, beginning to chop a violet-hued vegetable with practiced ease. It blends the flavors of the sea with the land, much like how I hope to blend with your world. Dan laughed, picking up a knife to help. I like that analogy. What's in the stew? Seaweed, tubers, and fish. The fish here is different, but I think it will work well, she answered, sliding the chopped vegetables into a pot. They worked in tandem. The kitchen filled with the sound of sizzling and the aromatic blend of spices. As they cooked, Dan took the opportunity to ask more about her life. So, what's a day like in your city? He queried, stirring the pot as Celera added a sprinkle of shimmering salt. It begins with the rise of the central glow, our artificial sun, and most go about their tasks in the community or the farms. We value collective efforts greatly, she described, her eyes distant with memories. That sounds quite communal. Here, people often pursue individual goals. Though there's community, there's a lot of emphasis on personal achievement, Dan mused, noticing Celera's intrigued expression. The conversation drifted from daily routines to hobbies and interests. Celera shared her passion for sculpting with hydroclay, a hobby that surprised Dan. You sculpt? He asked, intrigued. I'd love to see some of your work sometime. Perhaps I can show you how to sculpt, Celera offered with a gentle smile. It is soothing. Dinner was soon ready, and they moved to the small dining table with their steaming bowls of the Lassian stew. The first bite brought a pleased hum from Dan. This is excellent. It's like nothing I've ever tasted, Dan exclaimed, genuinely impressed. Celera looked pleased. I am glad you enjoy it. Sharing food is very important in my culture. It is how we build bonds. Well, then consider this bond building successful, Dan laughed, his spoon diving back into the bowl. As they ate, the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the room and bathing it in a golden light. The moment felt almost magical, bridging two vastly different worlds over a simple meal. Dan, Celera said thoughtfully after a pause, this is the first time I have felt somewhat at home since I arrived. Thank you. Dan met her gaze, sensing the weight and warmth of her gratitude. You're welcome, Celera. I'm glad you're here. I think we're going to learn a lot from each other. Indeed, as the evening wound down, Dan realized that this exchange was not just about helping Celera adjust. It was about expanding his own horizons, too. As Celera cleared the table, her earlier trepidation replaced by a calm ease, Dan knew that their journey together was just beginning. Dan planned a Saturday outing to help Celera get more acquainted with human customs and the local area. He hoped the market would be a good start, bustling with people and filled with earthly sights and smells that might intrigue her. Ready to explore some earthly commerce? Dan asked as they exited his apartment. I am eager to see more, Celera responded, her eyes bright with curiosity. The market was vibrant and noisy, vendors calling out their wares, and the aroma of street food filling the air. Celera looked around with wide-eyed fascination, her attention caught by everything from the colorful fruit stalls to the handmade crafts. Here, they sell products from local farmers and artisans. It's smaller scale, but it's a good representation of Earth's diversity, Dan explained, leading her from stall to stall. At a fruit vendor, Dan picked up an apple, handing it to Celera. Try this. It's fresh and crisp. Celera examined the apple, then mimicked Dan, taking a cautious bite. Her face lit up with pleasure. It's very refreshing, she noted, taking another bite. As they continued, Dan noticed Solera's fascination with a jewelry stall. The vendor, an elderly man with a kind smile, noticed her interest and held out a bracelet. "For you, miss. It suits you." Solera reached out, her fingers brushing the bracelet. She looked at Dan, uncertain. "Is it customary to accept?" Before Dan could respond, the vendor interjected. "No charge for the first-time visitor." Solera smiled and accepted the bracelet, but as they walked away, Dan noticed her expression change to one of concern. "What's wrong?" he asked. "In my culture, accepting a gift commits one to a reciprocal act. I am unsure what is expected of me now," she admitted. "Oh, here it's just a gesture of goodwill, especially to tourists. No reciprocity required," Dan reassured her. They stopped for lunch at a food stall selling street tacos, another new experience for Solera. As they ate, Dan asked, "How do you like the foods?" "It's very flavorful, different from ours, but I enjoy it," she said, though her focus seemed elsewhere. Noticing her continued distraction, Dan prodded gently. "You still seem troubled. Is it the bracelet?" Solera nodded. "Yes, I am worried about the proper way to respond. I do not wish to offend." Dan thought for a moment. "Would it make you feel better to offer something in return? Maybe share something from your culture that might be suitable." Solera agreed, looking relieved. They finished their meal and returned to the jewelry stall. Solera approached the vendor, who looked up with a welcoming smile. "I enjoyed your gift very much. I would like to share something from my world with you," Solera said, her voice steady but warm. She reached into her bag, pulling out a small, intricately carved piece of hydroclay, a miniature sculpture of a quai's marine life. She handed it to the vendor, who accepted it with wide-eyed wonder. "This is beautiful. Thank you. Your world must be a wonderful place," the vendor said, examining the delicate art. Solera smiled, clearly pleased. "Thank you for your kindness." As they walked away, Dan said, "See? You handled that perfectly." "I learned from the best," Solera joked, nudging him lightly. The rest of their market visit was less fraught, with Dan explaining more nuances of human interaction and Solera growing more comfortable with the exchanges. As they headed home, Dan reflected on the outing. "Did you enjoy the market, despite the hiccup?" "I did," Solera replied. "I learned not only about your market, but also about handling misunderstandings. I am grateful for both." Dan smiled, pleased with the progress they were making. "Good. There's plenty more to see and learn, and I'm here to help every step of the way." Solera's earlier anxiety had faded, replaced by a thoughtful appreciation. Their cultural exchange was shaping up to be more enriching than either had anticipated, filled with small lessons and shared experiences that were drawing them closer, not just as liaison and visitor, but as friends exploring a new frontier together. The sky darkened, and the first drops of rain began to fall as Dan and Solera returned from the market. The pitter-patter of rain against the windows seemed to make Solera uneasy. Noticing her discomfort, Dan turned to her with a concerned look. "Does the rain bother you?" he asked, pausing by the window to watch the downpour. "It reminds me of home, but not in the way I expected," Solera confessed, her gaze fixed on the droplets racing down the glass. "The sound is similar to the rain in our underwater cities, where it melds into the currents. Maybe we can use this time to share more about our homes. It might make the rain feel more comforting," Dan suggested, leading her to the couch with 2 warm mugs of tea. "That sounds nice," Solera agreed, wrapping her hands around the mug for warmth. As they settled in, Dan started, "Tell me about your family. What was it like growing up in an underwater city?" Solera's eyes lit up with the memory. "I have a large family, much larger than human families, I think. We live communally, always surrounded by cousins, aunts, and uncles. It's very noisy but comforting. Everyone takes part in raising the young ones." "That sounds wonderful," Dan said, genuinely intrigued. "It's more nuclear here. Families tend to be smaller, and while extended family can be close, we often live apart." Solera seemed puzzled by this. Is that not lonely? It can be, but it also encourages independence. But I do envy your close bonds, Dan admitted, sipping his tea. The conversation shifted as Silera asked about human customs. Dan explained various traditions, holidays, and the everyday dynamics of human social interactions. What about love and partnerships? Are they as communal as everything else in your culture? Dan asked, steering the topic to more personal aspects. In a way, yes. Partnerships are for life and are often arranged to strengthen community ties. It's less about romance and more about unity and strength, Silera explained. What about humans? We marry for love, mostly. It's personal and individual. Each relationship is unique, Dan explained, noticing Silera's fascinated expression. The rain continued, and they talked for hours, the sound of the storm a backdrop to their deepening understanding of each other's worlds. Silera seemed to relax as they shared stories, the initial homesickness eased by their conversation. Dan, may I ask something personal? Silera ventured, setting down her empty mug. Of course, Dan responded, attentive. How do you deal with loneliness? With your family so spread out, it must be hard, she asked, her tone thoughtful. Dan paused, considering her question. I guess we find community in other places. Friends, colleagues, interests. We build our tribes around us, not bound by blood, but by choice. Silera nodded slowly, absorbing his words. It's different, but there's beauty in that freedom to choose your tribe. Yes, exactly, Dan agreed, pleased with her understanding. As the rain began to lighten, Dan had an idea. Would you like to try something human? We could make a comfort meal from my childhood. It's simple, but always makes me feel better. Silera's smile returned. I would like that very much. In the kitchen, Dan taught her how to make grilled cheese sandwiches, a staple comfort food. They stood side by side at the stove, buttering bread and flipping sandwiches. The task was simple, but the act of cooking together seemed to cement their newfound bond. This is very different from Thalassian stew, but it smells wonderful, Silera commented as they sat down to eat. It's the little things, Dan said with a smile. Sometimes, comfort is a warm sandwich on a rainy day. As they ate, the rain stopped, leaving the world outside fresh and renewed. Inside, Dan and Silera found themselves in a similar state, renewed, more connected, and with a deeper understanding of each other's lives. They had not only shared food, but also parts of their souls, finding comfort in the shared human experience, bridged across worlds. Several weeks had passed since Silera's arrival on Earth, and she was adapting well, but the dryness of the indoor air was a constant discomfort for her. Seeing her discomfort, Dan had an idea to help her feel more at home. Maybe we could try something from your world tonight, Dan suggested as they finished dinner. A bathing ritual, perhaps? I read that water is not just for cleanliness in your culture, but a source of relaxation and rejuvenation. Silera looked up, surprised and pleased by his suggestion. Yes, it is a significant part of our daily life, a way to restore the body and the spirit. I would appreciate that greatly, Dan. Let's set it up then, Dan said, standing with a determined nod. In the bathroom, Dan tried to recreate a semblance of an Aquai's bathing environment. He adjusted the shower to a warm, gentle spray and dimmed the lights. Silera brought in aromatic oils from her planet, explaining their uses and benefits. As the water falls, we apply these oils. They help maintain our skin's moisture and have calming properties, Silera explained, handing Dan a bottle. Dan took the bottle, reading the label curiously. How do we start? Silera hesitated for a moment, then a faint blush colored her cheeks. In truth, it is customary for another to help apply the oils. It strengthens trust and bonding. Would you be comfortable helping me with this? Dan paused, sensing the importance of the request. Of course, Silera. I'd be honored to help. She smiled, relieved. Thank you, Dan. As she stepped under the warm spray of water, the bathroom filled with steam and the subtle scent of her oils. Dan watched for a moment, admiring how the water ran down her luminescent skin, creating patterns that reminded him of rain on a window pane. Celera handed him the bottle. "Just apply it like this." She showed him on her arm, her movements smooth and practiced. Taking the bottle, Dan poured some oil onto his hands and began to apply it to Celera's back. The task was intimate, more so than he had anticipated. He moved his hands carefully, ensuring the oil was evenly spread while respecting her comfort and space. "How is this?" Dan asked after a moment, his voice softer than intended. "It's perfect," Celera replied, her voice relaxed and grateful. "I haven't felt this much at peace since arriving here." They continued in silence, the only sounds the gentle hiss of the shower and the shift of their movements. Once done, Dan stepped back, giving her space. Celera rinsed off, the water washing away the oil but leaving her skin glowing and her expression serene. "That was more soothing than I expected," Celera said as she stepped out of the shower, reaching for a towel. "I'm glad," Dan responded, handing her another towel. "It's good to see you more comfortable." She dried off and turned to him, a sincere smile on her face. "Your help meant a lot to me, Dan. It was a significant gesture in my culture, as it should be in any. I understand. It's important to feel connected, to feel understood, especially when you're so far from home," Dan said, feeling the weight of their shared moment. "Exactly. And today, I truly felt like you understood a part of me that's deeply rooted in my culture," Celera acknowledged, her eyes meeting his. Dan nodded, feeling a connection that went beyond words. "I'm here to help, Celera, in any way I can." As they left the bathroom, the mood was lighter, the bond between them stronger. They had shared something unique and profound, a moment of cultural exchange that had deepened their friendship and mutual respect. "Shall we watch a movie or something? Something light to end the evening," Dan suggested, wanting to maintain the comfortable atmosphere. "That sounds perfect," Celera agreed, following him to the living room, a content smile playing on her lips. As they settled on the couch, Dan realized that these moments of understanding and connection were what truly made his job rewarding. The weekend found Dan and Celera in the kitchen once again, this time with a more ambitious culinary project in mind. Dan had been teaching Celera how to prepare various earth dishes, and today they were tackling homemade pizza. A far cry from the intricate dishes of HFYs, but a fun and interactive way to cook together. "Pizza is a classic on Earth, especially for gatherings," Dan explained as he laid out the ingredients. "It's simple but very customizable." Celera was intrigued, inspecting the array of toppings, cheeses, meats, vegetables, and even some seafood that Dan had included to make her feel at home. "This looks delightful," she said, her eyes sparkling with curiosity. "First, we make the dough. Here, let me show you." Dan scooped flour into a large mixing bowl, adding water and yeast. Mixing the dough by hand is part of the fun. "You ready to get your hands dirty?" With a playful nod, Celera rolled up her sleeves. "I am ready." Dan demonstrated the kneading process, pushing and folding the dough with practiced ease. Celera followed his movements, slowly getting the hang of it. As they worked the dough, Dan couldn't help but notice how natural it felt to be sharing such simple human traditions with her. "On HFYs, do you have dishes that bring people together like this?" Dan asked, spreading a thin layer of olive oil over the dough. "Yes, but it's usually more about the preparation of algae and sea crops. We have communal cooking sessions, especially during the high tide festivals," Celera shared, her voice laced with nostalgia. "That sounds like a beautiful tradition," Dan remarked, genuinely interested. "It is. Food is a celebration of life and community," she replied, smoothing out her dough with a flourish. They moved on to the toppings. Dan showed her how to spread the tomato sauce, and they each decorated their pizzas with various ingredients. Celera chose shrimp and a mix of colorful vegetables, while Dan stuck to more traditional toppings. As the pizzas baked, the aroma filling the apartment brought a cozy warmth that contrasted with the chill outside. They sat at the kitchen island, sipping wine while waiting for the timer to ding. This sharing of food and traditions, it's been enlightening, Celera said, her gaze thoughtful. It makes the vastness between our worlds seem smaller. Dan nodded, pouring her another glass of wine. I feel the same. It's not just about the food, is it? It's about understanding each other's lives. The small things that make us who we are. Exactly, Celera agreed, her smile bright. And I feel less like an outsider now, more like a part of something. When the timer went off, they took the pizzas out of the oven, admiring their handiwork. Looks delicious, Dan commented. They moved to the dining table to enjoy their creations, the conversation flowing easily between them. They discussed everything from movies and music to the complexities of interstellar politics, though they carefully steered clear of the more contentious topics. After dinner, with the dishes cleared away and the remnants of their meal packed up, Dan suggested a walk to digest their food. The city lights were a stark contrast to the dark skies above, and as they walked, the crisp air felt refreshing. It's beautiful at night, isn't it? The city lights the quiet, Dan said, his breath forming clouds in the cool air. It reminds me of the bioluminescence back home, Celera replied, looking around with a wistful expression. The glow of life beneath the waves. I'd love to see that someday, Dan said, imagining the underwater lights. Perhaps one day you will, Celera said, her tone hopeful. As they headed back, their steps in sync, Dan felt a profound sense of companionship. It was clear that their shared experiences were building a bridge between two very different lives, fostering a friendship that neither had anticipated but both now cherished. The atmosphere at Dan's apartment had shifted. What began as a mere acquaintance driven by necessity had blossomed into a deep, mutual understanding. Tonight was yet another step forward in their unique journey. A quiet evening planned with no agenda, but to enjoy each other's company. Dan, I was thinking about Earth's art forms today, Celera began, settling onto the couch with a soft throw draped over her shoulders. You have so many expressions, music, painting, dance. Back home, our expressions are more unified with our environment. Art is a big part of who we are, Dan agreed, handing her a cup of hot tea. It can convey emotions and ideas that sometimes words can't. That's true for us as well, though I think the way we integrate it with our surroundings might be different. Is there a particular form you're most fond of? Celera asked, genuinely curious as she took a sip of her tea. I've always been partial to music. It's like a universal language, isn't it? Maybe I could play some, Dan offered, moving toward his collection of music records. I'd like that, Celera replied with a smile. Dan selected a vinyl from his collection, and soon, the soft strains of a piano concerto filled the room. They listened in silence, letting the emotive chords and intricate melodies wash over them. This piece is soothing, yet evokes such strong emotion, Celera noted as the piece came to an end. It's designed to, Dan said as he returned to the couch. Music can be a powerful thing. The conversation drifted to Earth's cultural diversity, with Dan describing various musical genres and their origins. Celera was fascinated, her mind eager to absorb every detail. As the night deepened, a comfortable silence settled between them, filled only by the occasional clink of teacups or a soft sigh. Eventually, Dan turned to look at Celera, who seemed contemplative. "What's on your mind?" he asked gently. "I was just thinking about us, about all these evenings we've shared. I've learned so much from you, felt so much," Celera confessed, her voice low. Dan felt a warmth spread through him, a mixture of affection and something more profound. "I feel the same, Celera. There's something quite special about this, about what's happening between us." Encouraged by his words, Celera moved closer. On a quiz, when we feel a deep connection with someone, we share a bond, a way to show trust and affection. It's more than just friendship, it's a sharing of selves. Dan nodded, understanding the significance of her words. "Is that what you feel now?" "Yes, I think it is," she admitted, her gaze locking with his. Slowly, Dan reached out, brushing a strand of her hair back from her face. The touch was tentative, questioning, yet full of emotion. Solera's response was immediate. She leaned into his hand, her eyes closing briefly. "May I?" Dan asked, his voice barely a whisper. "Yes," Solera breathed out, her eyes reopening to meet his. Gently, Dan leaned in, and their lips met in a kiss that was soft and exploratory at first, but grew more confident as they both responded to the underlying current of their long-building emotions. Their hands found each other, fingers intertwining as they drew closer, deepening the kiss. When they finally parted, both were breathless, their foreheads resting against each other. "That was," Dan started, struggling for words. "Beautiful," Solera finished for him, a soft laugh escaping her. They spent the rest of the evening talking about what this meant for them, about the potential complexities of an interstellar relationship, but also about the possibilities. It was uncharted territory, but they were both willing to explore it together. As the night came to a close, and they prepared to sleep, the connection they had acknowledged felt like a natural progression of their journey. They fell asleep side by side, content in the knowledge that they were no longer just liaison and visitor, but something much more profound. The first light of dawn crept through the blinds, casting a gentle glow across the room where Dan and Solera lay. They had spent the night, sharing not only a bed but their dreams and doubts about the future, weaving their lives together with quiet words and tender touches. Dan was the first to stir, the soft light reflecting in his eyes as he turned to look at Solera, who was still asleep. He watched her for a moment, her chest rising and falling in a peaceful rhythm, her face softened in sleep. It struck him how much had changed in such a short time, and yet how natural it felt. As if sensing his gaze, Solera blinked her eyes open, a slow smile spreading across her face as she saw Dan watching her. "Good morning," she murmured, her voice husky from sleep. "Good morning," Dan replied, his hand reaching out to trace the line of her jaw gently. "Did you sleep well?" "Very well," Solera answered, leaning into his touch. "It feels different waking up here with you." "It feels right," Dan said, his voice low and full of emotion. They lay in silence for a while, basking in the newness of their relationship and the morning's quiet. Eventually, Dan propped himself up on one elbow, his expression turning thoughtful. "We have some decisions to make, don't we?" he asked, the weight of their situation settling over him like the morning dew. "Yes, we do," Solera agreed, sitting up and wrapping the sheet around her. "There are many things to consider. My stay on Earth, for one." Dan nodded. "We need to figure out what it means for you to stay here longer, or what it means if I were to visit Aquise. There's a lot of bureaucracy involved with interstellar relationships." Solera's smile was tinged with sadness. "I know, and there are cultural implications, too. We'd be facing challenges on both fronts. But," Dan said, his tone turning determined, "we can face them together if that's what we choose." "I'm willing if you are." "I am," Solera said without hesitation. "Dan, what we have, it's worth exploring, despite the obstacles." They got out of bed and made their way to the kitchen, where they began to prepare breakfast together in comfortable silence. Dan made coffee and toasted bread, while Solera chopped fruit for a salad. The domesticity of their actions belied the complexity of their discussions, yet both felt a reassuring certainty in their shared tasks. As they ate, they continued to discuss their options, mapping out potential steps to take regarding Solera's visa, possible reactions from their respective governments, and how they could begin integrating their lives more thoroughly. "It won't be easy," Dan said as he cleared the plates, "but I think it's worth it." "You're worth it." Solera took his hand, squeezing it gently. "And you're worth it to me, Dan. We will find a way." After breakfast, they dressed and decided to take a walk in the nearby park. The fresh air and the warmth of the sun felt invigorating as they discussed lighter topics, allowing themselves a momentary respite from the heavier discussions of the morning. As they walked back to the apartment, hand in hand, the reality of their situation felt less daunting. They were together, and that was what mattered most. Whatever challenges lay ahead, they would meet them as a team. Back at the apartment, Dan pulled Solera into an embrace, feeling the rightness of her in his arms. "Whatever happens next, we'll face it on our terms together," he whispered. "Yes, together," Celera echoed, her voice resolute. As the day grew older and the city around them buzzed to life, Dan and Celera faced the future not as two individuals from distant worlds, but as partners, united in their desire to bridge the space between stars.